If you're a subscriber and you've been keeping up with my more historical reactions, then you would know that in one of my past videos, I was questioning how World War II could only be the 5th deadliest war in all of history. So with the historical reactions, obviously there's so much more that we need to dive into, but right now we're focusing on World War II and how the heck something like that could have even happened. But specifically today, we have why World War II was so much deadlier than World War I, and I want to know why, like, the impact that this specific war had on the world, not just on, like, Europeans or the Axis powers, Allies powers. It affected the entire world, and I want to know, basically, to what extent. We just reacted to also the fallen of World War II, and I just think this video will give us a little more clarity and understanding of, like, how dire the whole situation in war was. So if you're new here, again, subscribe. Make sure you watch all my other historical reactions. There's a whole playlist. Please follow your girl on Instagram because I really want to get to 10K over there, and check out the Patreon for all the reactions that I cannot put on YouTube. They will be going on Patreon. So more of this, like, not gruesome, but more rough content, I guess you could say, reactions will go over there. But let's get into this video and make sure you like it to show your support. But yeah, why the heck was World War II one of the deadliest?
85 million casualties versus 16 million. World War II was the most disastrous conflict ever waged on Earth. But how was it many times more deadly than the previous World War? To understand the incredible loss of human life between the two world wars, it's important to know where.
And the fact that it really just, both wars started just because of some rebels, or because they wanted to change power, it was crazy. Freaking Mussolini went from being this, like, man of the people socialist to a fascist. That's so, like, you get so lost in your ideologies, and that's what I think. Like, I was listening, this is kind of a side note, I was listening to Yoko Ono yesterday for the first time, and that made me start thinking about John Lennon. And so I did some research on John Lennon, and the guy who ultimately took his life was, like, this crazed fan who had just discovered Christianity and, like, took offense to some of the stuff John Lennon would say. And that caused him to then commit that crime. And so I'm just thinking, like, when you get so deep into beliefs and ideologies, it's actually maybe not a good thing. Like, yeah, religion is great, but when you become, like, this huge evangelical, like, that it runs your whole life in your mind, maybe it's not as healthy as, like, you would hope it would be anyway.
Actually took place in both wars. World War I was so called because it involved all the major European powers who dragged their colonies into the fighting along with them.
Their colonies.
It would have been more fair to simply call it Europe's Great War, but thanks to colonialism, everyone got invited to the party.
I said, thanks to colonialism, everyone got... Ugh, that's so sad. In the video I posted from World War II from Oversimplified, I can't put it on YouTube because it got copyrighted. It's on Patreon. But I was so surprised in that video that Africa, like, the African countries were also tied into it. And you hear about Asia and all these other countries, and I was like, what the heck? I didn't know they were involved. But again, it's because of colonialism. Shout out to the British Empire.
Still, the vast majority of the fighting took place in Europe, with all the costliest battles of the war taking place on the continent. And it was a brutal affair, too. If you were a British soldier, you had about an 11% chance of never coming home again. But the scope of the heaviest fighting was rather geographically limited. When World War II came around, the world was more interconnected than ever up to that point. This, by necessity, meant that fighting had to be more global. Defeating major European powers no longer meant keeping the war in Europe. While much of the fighting still took place on the continent, Africa saw a fair share of fighting, with the Axis push to cut the Allies off from Middle Eastern and African oil. All along northern Africa still remained the rusted hulks of tanks and armored vehicles that clashed in the massive battles.
So it wasn't even just about the land or, like, taking over the land and country, it was the resources as well. Like, I knew that was true for Japan and China and Korea, I believe, but I didn't know that's what they wanted in Africa. I thought it was just because they were a part of these specific countries that all of a sudden now they're a part of the land fight and all that. But no, they wanted the resources too.
All in a bid to starve the Allies of precious oil. But this world war didn't just include European players. Japan invited itself to the chat, and its ambition to rule the Pacific put it on a collision course with the allied European powers who still maintained very lucrative colonies in the region. These colonies produced everything from food to all-important rubber to, once more, oil. And Japan just didn't want these resources for itself, it needed them. As an island nation, Japan is relatively resource poor and depends on importing vital resources from other nations.
Export rice.
This meant that the West would always have a leash on Japan, preventing it from rising as a major power by keeping its ambitions in check via threatening trade embargoes. The launch of hostilities in Europe was the opportunity Japan needed to take these lucrative colonies for itself, then kick the West out of the Pacific and establish the empire of the rising sun over Asia. Japan had already launched an invasion of China, which itself had been preoccupied with bitter infighting between the nationalists and the communists. These two sides temporarily set their differences aside and tried to repel the Japanese invaders.
Okay, I was about to say, obviously it makes it easier for Japan then to invade if you're already having your own civil war and already kind of discombobulated. But the fact that the Chinese people then came together and were like, wait, let's defeat this common enemy first, and then we can get back to boom, boom, boom to each other. But as we know, it didn't work out. Japan still infiltrated.
But Japan was better equipped and trained than the disheveled Chinese forces. China had, after all, just endured a century of humiliation where it was purposefully weakened and exploited by European powers. Despite absolutely dwarfing Japan, it was in no position to resist imperial Japanese forces. China would provide much of the raw materials and manufacturing power that Japan needed to fuel its empire. But there was still one Western power who could ruin all of Japan's ambitions: the United States of America. The U.S. had maintained a strong Pacific presence for decades due to the area's importance to international trade. Despite being the world's fourth largest country, the U.S. had always been a maritime.
Fourth largest? Let's see, Canada. Australia, but those are continents. China, Russia. Who are the five, who's bigger than us? Top 5 biggest countries. What the heck? Russia, of course, Canada, China, the US, and Brazil. Huh. Okay, so I got pretty much most of them.
Power. That's because of its unique position on the face of the Earth. It is the most important nation between the Atlantic and the Pacific, making it a balancing point between Europe and Asian powers. But U.S. national security strategy hinged on being a powerful...
Going back to that, how would you even invade? I don't think it's possible. Because on one side you've got a whole desert, on another side you've got freaking mountains, and then on the north it's freezing, on the south it's hot, hot, hot. You have to go through so many different terrain, not to mention just the landmass.
Point between Europe and Asian powers. But U.S. national security strategy hinged on being a powerful maritime power, and the nation was committed to tolerating zero incursion into its hemisphere of the Earth from any other major power, European or Asian. By the time that Second World War rolled around, the United States Navy was rivaling the vaunted Royal Navy, with the express purpose of ensuring that conflict was always far from home.
Whatever happened to the British military system?
Where the United States was keeping a very close eye on Japan. The Japanese expansionism had seriously disrupted U.S. trade in the region, and relations between the two powers were strained at best. The U.S. held the superior strategic position, with its forces capable of defending all important Pacific rubber plantations and oil fields. Japan was heavily reliant on American oil and industrial exports, and as long as this remained the status quo, the U.S. would always hold the leash on Japanese ascension. Thus, in December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy struck Pearl Harbor in a bid to...
That is so dumb, though. So you know that, basically what the video is saying is we hold all the control over you, so your next move is to bomb us? What? Who ordered the strike on Pearl Harbor? What were you even thinking? Instead of negotiation or peace or anything, your first move is to bomb?
Thus, in December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy struck Pearl Harbor in a bid to inflict catastrophic losses on the U.S. Navy and keep it out of the Pacific for good. At the same time, it launched an invasion of the American-held Philippines, looking to ensure the U.S. had no base of operations in the region from which to counterattack. The
Pacific they were trying to get us out of.
The Pacific theater had just made the Second World War the truly first global conflict.
Yeah,
and
on the whole
fighting
other side
raged across the entire face of the planet.
Yeah,
in the Pacific alone, it's estimated there were about 25 million casualties.
Well, it depends. Okay, is he saying that from Pearl Harbor in the invasion of the Philippines, where that battle was, that was 25 million? Or is he including us bombing them, dropping the atomic bomb? because then that would make more sense, 25 million. But if he's just saying 25 million, and I'm not sitting here trying to, because people got mad last time, got very sensitive whenever I said, yeah, then that's why we bombed them. But it's just fact. I'm not agreeing with it. I'm not disagreeing with it. The reason we bombed Japan is because they were performing some terrible, like, disgusting acts. They were doing experiments on people. It was, like, barbaric, some of the things they were doing. So, yeah, that's why we dropped a bomb on them. It's not like here nor there. I'm not agreeing with it. I'm not disagreeing with it. It's just what happened. But I don't know if this casualty number includes the bomb or before the bomb. If it's before the bomb, that's just, in my mind, another reason why we did it. 25 million of our own casualties? Yeah. You can't be so sensitive on the internet, guys.
More than total casualties for World War I. Only 6 million of those casualties were combatants. The rest, a whopping 19 million, were civilians. While both sides targeted civilians, with the Chinese and allies inflicting an estimated 1.2 million civilian casualties on Japan, the Japanese Empire killed Chinese civilians for sport, much like...
Did you hear what that just said? He said the Japanese were killing, after they've already invaded China and taken over, they were starting to kill the Chinese citizens just for sport, for fun, for pastime. And that's not even like you got the R word, if you know what I'm saying, you know what I'm saying. Again, the experiments, barbaricness, genuinely.
Allies inflicting an estimated 1.2 million civilian casualties on Japan, the Japanese Empire killed Chinese civilians for sport, much like Russia in Ukraine today. Most of the civilian casualties were Chinese, with between 7 and 8 million killed by the Japanese in mass slaughters, indiscriminate bombardments, or just falling prey to the ravages of war itself. An estimated 200,000 Chinese civilians were killed over 6 weeks in Nanjing alone, as the Japanese army turned killer.
Ooh, yeah, this is the book I was talking about, where you see the like crazy photos. Oh my god, I remember I read an excerpt, and there's like a woman in a... I feel so sick. How can you even do that to I know you're at war, but how can you even do that, though? Seriously. Like, I at that point, it's not even, oh, we're at war. That's just like you throwing away humanity. Nanjing is such a, like, disturbing part of history.
Into a contest. The addition of the entire new theater of war skyrocketed the total casualties for the Second World War, but technology would also turn this into the bloodiest conflict in human history.
Which, by the way, there's a video coming where we check out German inventions. They invented the freaking motorcycle. They invented the diesel engine. They invented the helicopter. And it kind of makes more sense as we do these reactions why they're coined for all these inventions. War.
At the onset of World War I, the airplane was a curiosity that most military commanders didn't quite know how to deploy. They knew it could make for a handy scout, though, and thus it replaced observation balloons in both armies, giving commanders a true bird's-eye view of enemy positions for the first time.
Unless you got shot down.
Information is power, though, and soon both armies started trying to shoot each other's planes out of the sky.
That's what I said.
The first aerial duels took place with pistols and achieved very little, but soon machine guns were being loaded onto airplanes as their engines became increasingly powerful. Some enterprise.
But at that point, wouldn't you just... Are you aiming to just, like, mess up the engine, or are you aiming to shoot the pilot? Because I was thinking they need, like, a big bazooka or some, like, cannon type thing to really injure the plane. But, like, what materials were the plane made out of? Like, where you could really shoot it out of the air with a machine gun.
Mines saw the potential of the airplane for directly attacking enemy positions from the air, though. And while machine guns were nice, if you really wanted to have an impact on the front, you needed to deliver mass death.
Airstrikes.
Airplane engines were still pretty weak, so the first aerial bombardment weapons were sharpened darts, carried aloft by the hundreds and dropped over the front. These sharp darts would fall from a great distance, and if they scored a hit, could be lethal for a soldier, creating a deep, wide wound that was impossible to stop bleeding. However, the darts were inaccurate, and very few of them actually ever found a target. If a dart missed, like most did, it presented little more than a tripping hazard for enemy soldiers. Grenades were soon being chucked out of the open cockpits of airplanes, but engineers dreamt of more. Bigger airplanes capable of carrying much more bombs, enough to have a significant impact on enemy units. The first bombers could only carry between 55 and 120 pounds of bombs, but soon aircraft like the Russian Ilya Muromets could carry as much as 1,500 pounds of bombs. The future was clear. Airplanes would become the most important weapons of the next World War.
So, like, for instance, Germany went from having no air force, or not being allowed to anyway, to now this being like a key factor in war.
When World War II broke out, Hitler's armies made excellent use of fighter and bomber aircraft as
Like
part
I said,
of Blitzkrieg, or lightning warfare. Pummeling enemy defenses from the air before the ground forces arrived helped soften them up for a ground attack. In the Pacific, Imperial Japan proved the age of the battleship was at an end when it nearly succeeded in defeating the United States of America in a single strike with aircraft launched via carriers. The airplane allowed massive bomb loads to be carried hundreds or even thousands of miles, and in numbers, planes could put entire cities under siege. Today, the accepted way of fighting a modern war is to engage enemy troops and destroy military and economically important targets. Civilian populations are off limits, and it's no longer acceptable to target them purposefully as part of your strategy to defeat the enemy.
That being said, though, remember 9/11, so I don't think, like, this way of thinking would be nice, but I'm sure there's still barbaric people out there who have those ideologies as the same ones who had it during World War II.
In World War II, the mass slaughter of civilians was the strategy for defeating the enemy. If a civilian population could be eradicated, the economic fallout would make it difficult or impossible to continue prosecuting a war. Mass killing of civilians also demoralized the enemy, prompting nations to sue for peace. Thus, in World War II, the targeting of cities was not just fair game, but key to success. In the First World War, civilian deaths numbered at around 10 million. In the Second World War, civilian deaths were twice as high as military deaths, at around 50 to 55 million. And the air...
Going back to the fallen of World War II, have everyone lined up in rows, it would be, you couldn't even see how many people, like, in your visual field. You wouldn't even be able to see all the people who had passed. It's really the common folk, like the worker people, who suffer the most with war. Not even the generals, not the politicians, not the government.
Plane made much more of that slaughter possible. During World War I, the artillery piece was the upper limit of how far one could threaten an enemy, typically a range of a few miles. With most fighting in World War I happening outside of population centers, this put civilians at low risk from direct combat deaths, with many of the deaths occurring due to the follow-on effects of the war, namely starvation and disease. However, in the Second World War, airplanes could threaten cities an entire nation over, or even further. And they could bring with them thousands of pounds of bombs, with bomber formations sometimes numbering in the hundreds. Indiscriminate bombing campaigns leveled entire cities, but special types of bombs made the killing much more efficient. Often cities were...
Why hasn't anyone developed a dome or utopia yet? You would think after all this, like, blitzkrieg, that someone would have made, like, you know, the AT&T Stadium? If you're from Europe, you probably don't, but those of you who are from America, you know the AT&T Stadium, how it's literally a dome, or how all the stadiums in the United States, we have these domes? Why haven't we constructed a dome that will literally cover the country if need be? We have enough money, we have enough resources to build it. Why doesn't anybody have one?
Were targeted with incendiary munitions or bombs designed to create little blast damage and instead fuel massive firestorms. The German city of Dresden was one of the victims of World War II firebombing and turned the entire city into a concrete skeleton covered in ash. Incredibly, the city was reduced to rubble in just 3 days, with 3,900 tons of explosives and incendiary devices dropped on the city by the British Royal Air Force. Such massive devastation.
Oh, I thought they were saying London got bombed. No, the British were the ones who bombed.
Devices dropped on the city by the British Royal Air Force. Such massive devastation in such a short period of time was unheard of in World War I and would have surely shaken both Allied and Central Power commanders to the core. But in the Second World War,
were these people able to live with themselves, like knowing what they all did to each other?
Was just par for the course. In the Pacific theater, though, air raids on civilian cities reached new catastrophic heights. While more civilians died in Europe, Japanese civilians were particularly vulnerable to air raids by the time that the strategic bombing campaign of Japan began in 1944. With Japan refusing to surrender, the Allies...
What was going on? Like, who was in charge of the Japanese army and the Japanese government at this time? Because at that point, they just did not care about anyone or anything but their own pride. To not even surrender. And I wasn't even considering, like, the Japanese civilians and what they had to, like, have been dealing with. They weren't asking for any of that. They didn't want their freaking government to invade China or fight America in the Philippines. Like, they were just probably farmers or lower class and just wanting to live their lives. And here they are, like, suffering from someone else's ambitions. It's unfortunate.
Allies began to plan an invasion of the Japanese islands to weaken Japan for the coming invasion and to attempt to convince the stubborn Japanese into surrender before such an invasion. Unrestricted bombing of the Japanese islands was approved. At first, air raids took place against military and industrial targets. However, major Japanese industrial centers were quickly reduced to rubble. By now, Japanese forces were so starved of fuel, trained pilots, and planes that they couldn't mount much, if any, resistance against air raids. Anti-aircraft guns on the ground were nearly useless, as they had difficulty reaching the high-flying American B-29s. With the loss of major industrial centers, the Japanese dispersed their industrial efforts across their cities to homes and small workshops. This made them much harder to target and neutralize, which prompted the approval of mass bombing of the civilian population.
Yeah, I saw that coming. And also, wasn't Japan's whole purpose to get resources from outward? So why did they, like, not reach out? Like, was the Pacific cut off at this point? Like, they couldn't reach out?
Population. Japanese cities were not just poorly defended from the air, but were particularly vulnerable to bombing. Very quickly on, the United States realized that using conventional high explosives was not very effective against Japanese cities, due to the fact that most buildings were constructed out of wood. High explosives were designed to destroy brick and mortar European cities, but Japanese cities were much more vulnerable to incendiary devices. Thus, U.S. bombers began to drop incendiary devices by the thousands over Japanese cities, sparking massive firestorms that razed cities nearly entirely. It wasn't just the massive volume of bombing carried out by the U.S., but also poor organization of civil defense that led to the massive destruction of Japanese cities and loss of life. Bomb shelters had never been created in large numbers in Japan, and it's unlikely the nation ever believed it would be subjected to the same massive bombing it was carrying out against Chinese cities.
What? How do you not, like, they didn't expect anyone to retaliate? You didn't think that would ever come back to bite you? Like, you're gonna do it to other people, but never suspected it would be done to you. Really? Who was in charge here?
Without bomb shelters, civilians had nowhere to shelter from the flames that spanned entire cities, and they were incinerated in the streets. But Japanese firefighters were also poorly trained and equipped for combating blazes, and this led to the fire raging completely out of control with no hope of stopping it. People may remember the nuclear bombs dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but massive aerial campaigns had so dwarfed the killing of the atomic bombs that when news of the total casualties from the bombings reached Imperial Japanese Command, they were mostly unperturbed. It was only
Here I thought, after we've burned your cities down, dropped 2 atomic bombs, you would wave the white flag and surrender. But he said, freaking no. This general, what was pride? Like, they were saying in the earlier part of the video, the whole point that Japan wanted to get so involved with the war on the whole other side of the world is because they were tired of feeling like they were underneath someone else's boot. But at this point, it's undeniable you're under the United States boot. So to spare yourself and your people, why not just surrender? But no, okay, let's see what they decided to do.
Bombings reached Imperial Japanese Command, they were mostly unperturbed. It was only the realization that a single bomb had caused so much devastation that gave them any pause. On the ground, the development of mobile warfare also helped fuel the massive casualties of World War II. Before World War II, troops moved largely on foot, and this limited both the speed and scope of an advance.
But the motorcycle was invented in like the 1800s, so why didn't anyone have motorcycles?
Out as widely or move as quickly as when warfare became mechanized. The marriage between tanks and mechanized infantry allowed warfare to become much faster, cover much more ground. This in turn meant that more territory could be covered, spreading the scope of the fighting and putting more civilian populations at risk. And nowhere did mobile warfare have a dramatic an impact as in the Eastern Front. In the First World War, Russia was defeated relatively early, and the German army didn't require an invasion to force its exit from the war. The violence resulted in an estimated 8 to 10 million dead, with many more that number wounded. In the Second World War, the Eastern Front saw a staggering 40 million dead, about 4 times World War I's figures. The invasion of Russia opened up an entire new front to the war that had been very limited in the First World War, and Hitler's brutal push to Moscow ended up making it the deadliest theater of the war. But Hitler was also busy pumping up his numbers by engaging one of the greatest atrocities in human history. Hitler dreamt of a pure Europe, one free of any race but the Aryan race, with perhaps a token number of survivors of other races to be used as slave labor. To make his sick fantasy a reality, he initiated wholesale industrial slaughter of anyone he deemed undesirable. To make his list, one only needed to be of another race or an undesirable political ideology, or be disabled. Hitler's dreams of a pure Third Reich left no room for anyone who wasn't whole in body and mind, prompting...
Why did Hitler think he was a part of that superior race? Did he ever look in a mirror? It's always the ones that look like spoiled cheese and spoiled milk that have the most to say about visuals and like superiority. Like the chosen one, are you serious? Please. You couldn't even go outside in Texas without getting a sunburn and literally scolding your skin, and you think you're the superior race. Are you dumb?
The mass slaughter of individuals with special needs. The best-known victims of the Holocaust are the Jewish people, who suffered between 5 and 6 million of their number killed in concentration camps and mass slaughters across Germany and occupied territory. As the German army conquered new lands, they began the systemic removal of all undesirables, herding them into ghettos where they were quarantined until transportation could be arranged to either work camps where they would live as slave labor or extermination camps. While inside cramped ghettos, they would be walled off from the outside world by barbed wire, armed guards, and often hastily erected concrete enclosures. Food was sparse, and mass starvation along with the disease led to the death of many long before the trucks and trains arrived.
So this is all going on congruently with the wars, like the fighting and the battles, while at the same time Hitler behind like closed doors and closed walls is carrying out these exterminations.
Often populations would be sorted either before being loaded onto trains or shortly after. From there, some selects deemed healthy or skilled enough would be sent to labor camps to work for industrial, German, and military goods. The rest, what the Nazis considered human chattel, were marked for extermination and sent directly to their deaths.
These are people, not cows or horses.
To strip nude and enter massive shower facilities. This was for their own health, they were told, but once they were inside, the doors were locked and all ventilation sealed. Then the deadly gas was pumped into the room, often causing agonizing death via asphyxiation. Dying inside a Nazi death chamber could take up to 15 minutes, and some even survived after being buried alive by corpses, only to be shot to death by Nazi guards after. But while the Jews suffered the most from the Nazi extermination efforts, they were far from the only populations of the Nazis killed in mass. As the Nazi armies poured into the Soviet Union, Hitler wanted to wipe out the indigenous population completely, so that Russia could be turned over into one giant pure German colony. To that end, he ordered a whopping 5.7 million Soviet civilians to be put to death. Many of them simply lined up and gunned down in vast rows. Massive pits would be dug, in front of which the Soviet prisoners were lined up, and as machine guns mowed them down, they would fall inside. Then a new row of prisoners would be lined up to meet the same fate. When the pit was nearly full, the Germans ordered the dirt to be spread out over it. The next group to suffer at the hands of the Germans were Soviet POWs. While the rules of war dictated that POWs were to be treated humanely, and the Germans treated Western POWs relatively well, in the East, German armies engaged in wholesale slaughter of captured Soviet forces. An estimated 2.8 to 3.3 million Soviet POWs were killed during the German invasion. Poland, which had been the first nation to suffer Germany's wrath, saw also up to 3 million of its citizens put to death. As many as 600,000 Serbs, 500,000 Romani, 25,000 Slovens, and 3,500 Spanish Republicans fighting against Hitler were also exterminated. Hitler's drive to purge undesirables also spread to the disabled both at home in Germany and occupied territories. Approximately 270,000 disabled people were killed by the Nazis. Political or religious ideology was also a reason for extermination, with as many as 200,000 Freemasons exterminated, alongside up to 5,000 Jehovah's Witnesses. Hitler also targeted homosexuals in Germany and the territories he conquered, killing as many as 25,000. The wholesale slaughter of entire populations was one of the major reasons why the Second World War was far deadlier than the First.
And the fact that no one in his cabinet was like, hey, let me get rid of this guy. Like, what the heck?
First time in history mankind had industrialized mass murder. And had the war lasted longer, these casualty numbers would be astronomically higher. In fact, it was Germany's later troubles in the war that actually prevented even more killing. As war materials began to run short, Germany could no longer afford to transport hundreds of thousands of would-be victims to waiting extermination camps, and the drain on manpower and resources caused by the actual fighting spared many from Nazi killings. Now go check out how Nazi gas chambers actually...
Oh, God. Oh, my God. Towards the end there, I kind of just started getting sick at the thought of all this. I've seen the theories and the... What do you call it? Not theories. But, like, the things people are saying, oh, he's in this country, he didn't actually die, blah, blah, blah. Wherever Hitler is, whether it's hell, whether it's some island on a nice coast, he has his fate waiting for him. If he hasn't already met it, he's going to one day.